long lead-in, but listen to every single word. Take notes. Listen again. The show will live here at the free show link and iPod download for at least 1 week, 24/7. The man you are going to hear is a whistleblower who is pointing out who benefited from 9/11, what was behind it, the kind of software and alert system in place, and who made the big bucks on 9/11. His name is Richard Andrew Grove. He's an excellent speaker. He's a fearless American patriot. So remember that, as usual, you heard it first on the Maria Heller Show. So this is not a corporate-owned show. This is not a make-believe progressive show. This is an American just like you who wants to work on saving our country and getting the truth out there. So without further ado, please share this interview far and wide with every journalist you know, every 9/11 person you know, every neighbor you have, everybody on your email list. So without further ado, I'm going to present Excellence, Richard Andrew Grove.
This transmission reached you on April 23rd, 2006, and is addressed to the future of America. A grandmaster chess player can think 20 or more moves deep, in essence, calculating a Google of possibilities in his or her mind before making a move. Now, if I were to contend that I could sit down with 8 of the world's master chess players, and using only the aid of a pencil and paper or less, play them simultaneously, guaranteeing that I could win at least 4 out of the 8 games, and that I could repeat this feat at will any time, would you bet for me or against me? Keep that in mind. Now, what if I told you that by simply dividing the 8 expert strategists into 4 pairs, you could simply play the first player's moves against the third player and the second player's moves against the fourth, and so on, so that essentially the Grand Masters would all be playing each other, with only the illusion that you were making mockery out of their individual talent? Would it make any difference in how you perceive my abilities? Only if I disclosed how I did it, and when that disclosure was made, of course. You see, I've been studying illusions, but more to the point, I've been studying the illusionists. J. Edgar Hoover once said, "The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous, he simply cannot believe it exists." And he would know, as I believe that Hoover is someone who spoke from experience, not conjecture. In the spirit of Hoover's observation, I'm here to ask the question, what if such a monstrous conspiracy were broken down, processed, and then distilled into an easily comprehensible format, wherein it was effectively communicated to the audience by taking them behind the scenes, where the illusions could be easily understood by all who wish to see, and perceived in a way that cannot be unlearned? What if the audience were shown the critical perspectives from which the illusions cease to hold any influence over their thoughts, feelings, and actions? In other words, I'm looking for someone else who sees the proverbial elephant in the middle of the room, someone who sees likewise that there's too much not being talked about, events which affect all of our lives. That's a major challenge I've struggled with over the past several years because I have solutions for the problems presented in the new normalcy that has flooded our society post 9/11, but it's next to impossible to communicate the solutions to the people, many of whom think that the illusions are indeed real. And the most horrifying reality of the illusions to which I am referring is the pain that innocent people are suffering because so many people in our country are congregated together in the 51st state, the state of denial. On the other hand, I think that you probably do have an idea that something's wrong, and that's why you're listening to this. And based on what I'm about to share, I think that you'll feel both empowered and motivated by the overall feeling you're left with after listening. The gravamen of what I have to share within this message outweighs any measure necessary in order to achieve a line of communication with you. So thanks for taking the leap of faith necessary to grant me this impromptu meeting. After all, it's not as simple as picking up the phone and calling people these days with this sort of information, because even if I had dialed your number, we wouldn't be the only ones listening. Now, I say this not out of paranoia, but rather as a result of having been on the other side of the information technology systems, and I'm familiar with how the data is collected, applied, and manipulated and used against the American people. And I think that more people would be interested if only this information were to find its way to their attention. And though I wish that this message could find its way to all the voices which are influential in our society, I'm thankful that I've at least gained the audience with someone of influence, someone who has demonstrated a sincere interest in helping the truth find its way to the public mind. What I'm asking for you to do is lend me your attention and hear me through to the end, and if you do, I think that in hindsight, you'll see that your cognitive participation in this exercise is being time well invested. The events I'll be discussing relate to the who, how, and whys of September 11th, why this information is being suppressed, who's suppressing it, and how I came to make this recording as an escalated measure to communicate this information to the people who can use it to heal America, people like yourself. But first, I should ask, do you really want to know what happened on September 11th? Moving forward under the assertion that you do, I've taken the liberty to write out some of what I need to say, and I've done this as a precautionary measure because the relations I make herein are complicated, dangerous revelations, and I think that we have a duty to make our best efforts to be specific and precise in what we say and the language that we use to address the topic of September 11th. What brings me here to you today is my experience, a chain of events and causal consequences which forged the foundation from which sprung thousands of hours of research and has led me in many hundreds of attempts to enlist the interest of people like yourself, people who have the experience and resources, but not necessarily all of the information critical to catalyzing the American people into action. I'm going to challenge you to think, and since the only thing our leaders can recommend we do to help win the war on terror is pay higher gas prices and look the other way while they plunder our future, I'm here to ask that you take what I have to say to heart, because you can do something about what's going on. You see, we live in a culture of fear, yet the only thing to fear is not having the truth available. I've found that there are few people left in our society who have a voice and corresponding influence in the public arena, and even fewer who have their perspective from which they can accurately direct those who are willing to listen to their message, and still even fewer who are willing to shoulder the consequences of making outspoken statements in a society which now frowns upon people who think for themselves or raise question and concern when they see other people being hurt. For the sake of making a formal introduction, my name is Richard Grove. I've been a national security whistleblower in two separate instances, both of which intimately relate to the events of September 11th. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, and though I regret not being there in person, I'm hoping that this medium will provide the next best thing, a direct line of communication so that you can listen to me say this in my own words and hear it for yourself firsthand. The chronological path I've mapped may seem circuitous at first, but if you listen along, at the end you will find a point, because in my humble opinion, you're it. You see, the solution is getting this information to people like you, as it is my contention that when this information is introduced to an objective mind, it is inevitable that a meaningful, benevolent, and constructive causality will manifest as a result. I'm looking for leaders who can help bring together the critical resources necessary to fight the fire of tyranny with communication. People who can help unite those who are aware and see the danger, so that others may be given a chance to live free. And it's my desire to create a forum wherein we can teach others how to do likewise. If one were to look at the events of 9/11 as a battle wound to the body that is our nation, the current state of our union would be this. We've been ambushed by a yet unidentified enemy. We're critically injured, but we haven't cleaned or dressed the wound, or found who's responsible. As you're either aware or about to learn, we were attacked by rogue factions using elements of our own resources against our own people. But in response, we've invaded sovereign nations instead of addressing our own problems here at home. We've allowed a gangrenous administration to infect all corners of the Congress and focus on profiting from 9/11 instead of finding the real terrorists. We, the people, are responsible for letting this wound fester into a life or death struggle for America, and we, the people, will have to be the first ones to take the steps necessary to localize and treat the infection and create an environment wherein true healing and closure can begin. I'm here because I don't have an established forum to introduce this information to the public mind, but quite possibly you have the resources and or experience at your disposal to successfully progress, or even possibly accomplish that which I have not yet been able to achieve due to my limited resources. I envision this communication as the beginning of a constructive dialogue that reveals the granular details of widely suppressed evidence pertaining to the events of September 11th and the consequential aftermath. I chose to create this message because there are too few who are able to articulate what happened on September 11th beyond the contention that the official story is a hoax, And there are even fewer still who see that the official story is actually a prime example of psychological warfare being used to deceive the public. But most people I talk to want to leave it at that. And when I ask them, so what do you think happened? The question is usually followed by silence, and it's in the presence of that silence wherein I wonder how much people really care, if they're not actually willing to do some researching on their own and look for themselves. Certainly I can't be the only person who's troubled by the fact that it's been almost 5 years, and those allegedly seeking the truth are still asking the same questions as they were on September 12, 2001. You may be wondering at this point why I care so much about finding and sharing the truth behind the events of September 11th. Well, I'll shed some light. To begin with, I experienced the New York-related events that morning firsthand, and therefore my perspective and ideas about 9/11 are not based on what the media has reported. Rather, they're based on what I personally observed at Ground Zero and what I've learned since then through my own study of the events. What's more, I, like many others, lost peers, co-workers, and friends on that horrific morning, all of whom were premeditatively murdered in cold blood, some of whom were actually working behind the scenes with me and attempting to help me blow the whistle. On what? Well, that's the $7 trillion question, isn't it? In the months preceding September 11th, I was not alone in sensing that there was something amiss while I was working in the World Trade Center. But I was the only one that I know of to raise my voice, and in retaliation, I was promptly terminated, to set an example. In many ways, it is only due to the fact that I was illegally terminated for having blown the whistle that I'm here today, alive and attempting to relate the hidden details of these events to you. And I'm doing this because I think the gift of consciousness should be used to save lives and improve our world, not take them and destroy it. And so this is what I can do to help those suffering at the hands of others. You see, on that particular morning, I was to present evidence, which I still possess, to my ex-co-workers at Marsh & McLennan, on the 98th floor of World Trade Center 1, the North Tower, which exploded while I was in traffic on my way to this meeting, and I was only a few blocks north of the World Trade Center complex, heading south on West Street, just south of Canal at 8:45 a.m., in a convertible with the top down. Aside from witnessing events which contradict the official story, I experienced the horror of bearing witness to a situation wherein my peers were trapped in a burning building, and realizing that there was nothing that I could do to help them. As they lost hope and began to jump, in some cases hand in hand, the flailing of their bodies as they were pulled helplessly toward the earth was almost the most disturbing part of my experience that morning. I was within 2 or 3 blocks of the North Tower when the South Tower exploded. And perhaps you can relate when I express how truly surreal it is to be trapped in an experience wherein what you witness and what is shown to the world are night and day contrasts. For a long time after that morning, I knew it was too risky to even engage with people who were interested, because the media and the administration had made it exceedingly clear that nothing but the official story would be tolerated, which meant that people who think for themselves and or think differently became the new target in the birthing war on terror. Anyone who has read the 300-plus page Patriot Act can readily see that the actions being taken are for the purpose of dissolving the Constitution, deleting constitutional rights of privacy, speech, etc., and basically treating every American as a potential and plausible terrorist, because the information is being collected on every single one of us. Giving up our freedoms in order to attain alleged security can only result in a loss of both. And that's why you have Halliburton building concentration camps in our backyards and the Constitution being neutered by the Patriots Act 1 and 2. And if that's news to you, Google on Oliver North's Rex 84 program or FEMA camps, or the civilian inmate labor program being prepared by the Army for U.S. citizens. It's an unfortunate legacy that we're all inheriting care of the current administration, which has used 9/11 as a springboard opportunity, wherein trillions are spent or lost without question or consequence. Countries are invaded without legitimate opposition and under provably contrived pretexts, and the Constitution is circumvented through coercion. Trillions of dollars of debt have been approved in addition to the loss of liberty that comes with the Patriot Act. And the combination of these remedies have produced not one legitimate investigatory outcome, be it trial by jury, victory in war, or unobjected support of a domestic and foreign policy by an informed public. Samuel Clemens said it best. I guess the government that robbed its own people earns the future that it is preparing for itself. You know, for many people out there, the whole 9/11 controversy is just too hard to think about. And that's why it works. The lie is simply too big for most to conceive of or realize, even in the face of so many blatantly irreconcilable contradictions. Because the theft is simply beyond their conception of what is real. So they end up reverting back to their hypocrisy-addicted habitual slothness, tuning into reality conditioning sponsored by AIG, Lockheed Martin, or the government employee insurance company better known as Geico. And as I'm sure you're aware, the junk media people consume every day emboldens their denial, and as a result, the American people have become so estranged from the truth that they basically have to risk insanity to follow the diabolical machinations of the events to their source of origin. Fortunately, I've had a unique opportunity and the critical support necessary to do just that, and return with the proverbial fire, if you will. I'm here today to share suppressed truths, which if used reconstructively can inspire the American people to regain their rights, freedoms, and liberties by restoring the Constitution. Because the overall idea you will be left with is truly revolutionary. What struck me most ominously that morning was not what I saw at the top of the towers, but what I encountered at ground level when I discovered that we were all being deceived. And by that, I'm not talking about the jack-in-the-box Islamist extremist boogeyman who allegedly successfully commandeered and drove commercial airliners into the tops of the towers with military precision. I'm talking about participants who were plausibly associated with United States intelligence agencies and taking non-rescue actions at the base of the towers. The specific details of what I'm alluding to I'm not going to explore right here, as they're far too sensitive to explore without first setting the proper context, which is outside the perimeters of this transmission. And to that end, I'll continue with a high-level overview. What happened at the top of the towers that morning in many senses served the same purpose as a magician's wand. The events at the top were, in part, a sick sort of diversion to draw attention away from any events going on at and below ground level. As we all continue to learn more about this topic, we start to comprehend the grandiosity of the thefts and fraudulent transactions that took place under the umbrella of 9/11. Specifically, the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of gold bricks that were surreptitiously liberated from their safety deposit vaults under the World Trade Center. Couple that with the realization of the verifiably true statement made by Donald Rumsfeld on September 10th of 2001, wherein he announced that $2.3 trillion in U.S. taxpayer funds had been misappropriated by Pentagon accountants and, quote, lost. Let me do a quick thought experiment with you. If I drew a line, 1 foot in length, on a whiteboard, and that line represented $1 million, how long would a line representing $1 billion be? What about $1 trillion? The answers are 1,000 feet and 189 miles, respectively. And keep in mind, that's using 1 unit equals $1 million. So if $1 was equal to 1 foot, $1 trillion would be 189 million miles, or in everyday terms, to the sun and back. My point is that we're talking about trillions of dollars missing, and we're talking about the largest crime ever committed, right in front of all of our lives, and using 9/11 as the getaway vehicle. And what was stolen was our collective future, and I think it's about time we all realized it. You see, not only did Rumsfeld's September 10th, 2001 announcement not draw much attention then, but even today it's widely unknown. And it's worth mentioning here that DynCorp, which is partially responsible for the bogus Pentagon accounting, is still receiving tens of billions annually in Pentagon contracts. In other words, it's my contention that what America doesn't know is exactly what's killing America and Americans. Based on that contention, if we simply build a mechanism to restore the unrestricted flow of information to the people, the country should self-resuscitate. If a resource were created to aggregate and correlate all of the data collected by those of us who have been independently observing, documenting, and waiting for an opportunity to come together and share, then, and likely only then, will the people have a fighting chance to realize that the war is being waged on us and not them, them being, of course, the alleged terrorists. And maybe all that's needed is for someone like you to take the time to listen to someone like me and let the truth continue to take its course. I'm approaching you for guidance because the nature of what I'm relating is simply impossible to communicate via the traditional mechanisms for informing the public mind, as in this case the corporate mass media is, either willingly or unwittingly, part of the fraud. Without the intervention of people like yourself who have the ability to communicate with a vast and potentially unlimited audience, there is little hope that any of what follows will be widely consumed, at least until people literally dig it up in the future. The comprehension of what I'm sharing dissolves the foundation of rhetoric, upon which is built the justification for illegal arrests, secret police, rendition flights, torture, and mass genocidal activities, all of which add up to today's post-9/11 era where the events of September 11th are used as cover for the most evil atrocities ever devised by humanity and blindly accepted by a majority of the public. Whether it's checkpoint data systems getting $4 million to rig the 2000 election to reserve the White House for the regime in power via Catherine Harris and Jeb Bush's office, or the use of the anthrax attacks to coercively pass the Patriot Act, illegal invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the use of the Muslim community as the contemporary Lee Harvey Oswald, or Elliot Spitzer's pseudo-investigations of both 9/11 and the hundreds of billions stolen in the insurance fraud, which came soon after September 11th, involving the corporations who provided service and aid to the real terrorists who perpetrated the atrocities that morning. And perhaps you're one of the few who I would not have to convince that 18 militant Islamic extremists with paper cutters had no control over NORAD's planning of simultaneous exercises on 9/11. Giuliani's participation in those exercises, or the Securicom and Kroll Associates security experts who ordered the people in the South Tower to, quote, return to their offices in order to raise the death count. For me, over these years, as I've struggled to gain an audience with people like yourself, people who have the power to both listen and act, the only unanswered question has been, who can I go to with this information who will use it for the right purposes? And of course, in these types of situations, there are always people out there who are profiting heavily from the activities I'm about to disclose. And without a strategic plan, it's likely that one would meet a similar fate as Mark Lombardi, or William Cooper, Gary Webb, Hunter S. Thompson, or any of the other hundreds who have been suicided for attempting to speak their mind. So we must take care. My goal herein is to build out a faithful rendering summarizing the experiences which led me to create this exercise in communication, so that you can see the forest for the trees, so to speak. What you're about to hear is probably nothing like what you've heard anyone else say in relation to 9/11, and arguably, that's why so many still have unanswered questions. So with no further ado, I'm going to relate to you an unfinished but verifiably true story, and I'm going to ask you to help me determine how it continues from here. Here's where I'll begin. In 2000, I worked for a software development entity called Silverstream Software. I worked in sales, and in October of that year, I won the largest client in company history, which soon thereafter led to the acquisition of Silverstream by Novell. In contextual hindsight and considering my audience, Mike Gordon Gecko was a client named Marsh & McLennan. Marsh, of course, is the world's largest insurance brokerage. And you might also recall that Marsh was located right below Cantor Fitzgerald in the North Tower, and approximately 295 Marsh employees were murdered that morning, along with the other innocent victims and employees who either knew too much or too little about their chosen work environment. Silverstream's technology was on the cutting edge of Internet solutions, offering software to web-enable the critical business functions of Fortune 500 companies, basically integrating and making available on the web the disparate legacy applications and mainframes, while simultaneously streamlining workflow and traditional paper processes, with the end result, of course, being a lower cost of operation and more efficient transactions, because inefficiencies like people were being taken out of the loop. And here's where it gets interesting. Silverstream had built internet trading and transactional platforms for Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, Bankers Trust, Alex Brown, and Morgan Stanley, to name a few. I was responsible for some of these accounts at one time or another, and coincidentally, several of these companies purchased space in the World Trade Center and simultaneously completed disaster recovery and business continuity implementations just prior to 9/11. And hopefully you're already somewhat familiar with the roles these financial institutions played in September 11th. And if you include Marsh & McLennan and another client of mine in 2001, AIG, on the list, you pretty much have the major players involved in the financial aspect of the 9/11 fraudulent trading activity. You might have also noticed the hidden information regarding Marsh in the bottom half of the screen, approximately 6.5 minutes into loose change. I didn't realize the scope of these connections myself until about a month after 9/11, when I read Mike Rupert's article on the criminal insider trading that took place on September 11th. Rupert's contentions are accurate to a great degree, but it's also important that one separate his documented facts from his peak oil theories. Now, I mention this only in passing because it has everything to do with the gas prices these days, and since people are now pawning their possessions to fill their tanks, I figured I'd mention it just in case you're interested. You see, whether or not oil is truly a fossil fuel and therefore depletable, or is actually abiotic and therefore regenerative, is up for debate. However, I agree that oil is used to exert a measure of control on populations, and to that end, you may want to check out a book called The Deep, Hot Biosphere sometime, as it explains that oil is not a fossil fuel and therefore not in danger of running out, but I digress. If you're interested in researching what I just mentioned about the financial institutions involved in 9/11, just Google Buzzy Krongard plus A.B. Brown, and you'll see the connections to our intelligence community. Getting back on track, let me tell you what Marsh was up to. In 2000, Silverstream was contracted by Marsh to provide a technological solution beyond what we had done for any of the above-named companies, insofar as it will be used to electronically connect Marsh to its major business partners via internet portals for the purpose of creating paperless transactions and expediting revenue and renewal cycles, and built from the ground up at the client's site. Silverstream provided a specific type of connectivity that was used to link AIG and Marsh & McLennan, the first two commercial companies on the planet to employ this specific type of transaction, and in fact, Marsh was presented with something called the Accord Award, ACORD, in the summer of 2001 for being the first commercial corporation to do so. And what you should take away from that is this. It means that no other companies were doing this type of transaction, so the question in your mind should be, what then were Marsh and AIG doing, and why did they need to leverage technologies that no other commercial entity on the face of the earth needed to conduct business? Due to the nature of the Marsh.com project, when I closed this deal in October of 2000, no product was delivered, per se. But the fact that my company did not have a, quote, product to, quote, sell, did not present a challenge to Silverstream, whose executives invented a way to take over $1 million from Marsh up front, before we'd even started to build the project on-site inside of the North Tower. Once securing a contract, Silverstream then stationed approximately 30 to 40 developers at Marsh, and this team was led by 2 to 3 managers with whom I liaised to ensure delivery of the solution that was promised. The development team worked regularly into the night, if not all night, and sometimes worked 7 days a week in order to adhere to Marsh's indicated pre-September 11th deadline. Now, while I was good friends with a few of the developers, many of these developers I did not know, not even as acquaintances. I do, however, have documents which reflect the names of many of these people and their corresponding timesheets. I first noticed physical anomalies with respect to the Marsh.com project when I was in a meeting on the 98th floor in October of 2000 with a gentleman named Gary Lasko. Gary was Marsh's North American Chief Information Officer, and that particular afternoon a colleague and I helped him identify about $10 million in suspicious purchase orders after I had recognized that certain vendors were deceiving Marsh and specifically appeared to be selling Marsh large quantities of hardware that were not necessary, as this was later confirmed by Gary. In the spring of 2001, I was negotiating a $5 million renewal contract with Gary to complete Marsh's list of requirements for the Marsh.com project. Simultaneous to my efforts to close this deal, I was concerned that Silverstream was overbilling Marsh to the tune of about $7 million or more. I brought my concerns up to executives inside of Silverstream, and I was urged to keep quiet and mind my own business. I went to an executive inside of Marsh, and he advised me to do likewise. But then, I mentioned it to a few executives at Marsh who I could trust, like Gary Lasko, and Catherine Lee, Ken Rice, Richard Bruhart, and John Olthofer, people who became likewise concerned that something untoward was going on. The concerned colleagues I just mentioned were murdered on September 11th, and the executives who expressed dismay at my concerns are alive and free today because of it. I feel it is no coincidence as the Marsh executive who urged me to drop my line of inquiry made sure that his personnel, who I just mentioned, were in the office bright and early for a global conference call before the staff meeting upon which I was to intrude. A conference call which I was informed this executive in question conducted, but attended from the safety of his Upper West Side apartment. Although in getting ahead of myself again, I will mention that this executive in question, whose name I will not disclose here, is intimately affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations. On June 4th, 2001, I sent an email to members of my sales team asking whether or not they were likewise concerned that apparently Silverstream was billing Marsh millions of dollars above and beyond the numbers we were being paid commissions on. Therefore, either we were being denied our rightful commission, or Silverstream was defrauding Marsh. That same day, I attained verbal approval from Gary Lasco's people that Silverstream would be getting the next leg of the Marsh Phase 2 contract. I telephoned my boss and gave him the good news, and he called his supervisor, the VP of Sales for Silverstream, a man named John Judge. The commission on his pending sale would plausibly grant me the opportunity to leave Silverstream and start a life on my own, as it would have been a payday worth well over $1 million. On June 5th, 2001, the very next morning, Judge flies to New York and hides behind the door in my boss's office. I'm lured in there under false pretenses and terminated on the spot. What's more, Judge took it upon himself to share with me how much he enjoyed flying in just to see the look on my face. Nice guy, right? From that point, I was encouraged to keep quiet about what I knew and to take some time off, so I did. I flew to Cabo San Lucas with some friends and purchased some vacation property, and I forgot all about Silverstream. I even considered staying there for a while, but thankfully I didn't. So here's where it starts to get a little more unusual, because suffice to say, a great deal of pressure had to be applied to redirect my life of leisure to where I stand today speaking to you like this. In August of 2001, I was in Boston, and after being rushed to 2 different hospitals, I had emergency surgery, which I was told saved my life. Oddly enough, during my state of recovery in late August, the chief financial officer from Silverstream offered to pay me $9,999.99 to sign a contract. And one of the last requirements of this contract was that I not mention this contract or what led to it to anyone. He also told me that he wanted to offer more, but anything over $10,000 would have to be reported to the board of directors. Interesting, right? So despite agreeing to this contract at the time, I decided in hindsight that it was all suspicious, the whole scenario. And though it took me a couple weeks to recover from surgery, as my mind cleared, I felt that I needed to go back to my colleagues at Marsh and at least apprise them of my concerns, because they were the ones being lied to every day, and they were the ones still working there. A colleague inside of Marsh arranged for me to attend a staff meeting, which would be on break at the time of my arrival, where I would then re-enter into the meeting along with others who were likewise concerned about the illicit fiscal activities. Our intent was to openly question the suspiciously unconcerned executive who seemed to be at the center of the controversial secrecy. The man who was to be confronted is the same Marsh executive who conveniently did not go to the World Trade Center that morning, the same man who told me to look the other way, the same man who is currently in a partnership with a Council on Foreign Relations member. Before I move on to some other important topics and experiences, I'd like to share with you some insight about the who, how, and why of September 11th. Without getting into the sordid details of why the towers were brought down through controlled demolition and making the connections between the associated risks and costs of asbestos removal and the infamous decision made by the terrorists to take a money-losing operation and turn it into a money-making, never-ending war, I'll offer this sample. First, I would note that L. Paul Jerry Bremer, who was in charge of the coalition reconstruction element of the post-9/11 Hegelian plan being carried out in Iraq, used to work for Heinz Kissinger, better known to the public as Henry. Bremer was also the one who announced the capture of Saddam Hussein, lucky guy, and was responsible for approximately $10 billion unaccounted for in Iraq reconstruction money, which was donated by way of U.S. taxpayers' blood, sweat, and tears. In fact, I've seen the accounting protocols, or rather lack thereof, that went on in Iraq. It's a complete fraud to the American taxpayer. Open, unguarded flatbed trucks with bricks of billions of U.S. dollars out in the open, driving around without anyone keeping track of where they're going or who was receiving the money. But here's what you probably don't know. L. Paul Jerry Bremer's last gig before capitalizing on the Iraq War was at Marsh & McLennan, where Jerry was the CEO of Marsh's Risk Management Collective. You know, it's interesting that no one else has noticed that Marsh was at the heart of 9/11, and despite being woven into almost every aspect of the events, few question Marsh's role in any of it. Secondly, I would note that Stewart Air Force Base in New Windsor, New York, is used as a hub for the importation of illicit drugs, using our military assets as cover. Coincidentally, Stewart happens to be the simultaneous crossing point of 2 hijacked airliners on September 11th, and also the approximate location where the transponders were switched. Stewart Air Force Base was previously known as the base where the Iran hostages were returned after the 444 days in the October surprise. This predated, but of course is not unrelated, to the Iran-Contra fraud. Interestingly, Stewart Air Force Base is the only airport of its kind in that it was privatized for secret purposes. This privatization was executed in part by George Pataki and Elliot Spitzer. In 1999, Pataki signed a 99-year lease, a la Larry Silverstein, and in 2000, Spitzer privatized it for, quote, special use. Spitzer, of course, is the Attorney General of New York, a supposed real-life crime fighter. I wish that were true, but I ask you to take a look for yourself and judge the evidence. Spitzer allegedly investigates 9/11, but no real progress is made. Simultaneous to this, Spitzer allegedly investigates the post-9/11 AIG Marsh insurance scheme, wherein hundreds of billions of dollars were skimmed from fattened insurance quotes. And it's my contention that the technology that my ex-employer provided was fundamental to the perpetration of this scheme. Spitzer's investigation finds AIG guilty, yet only penalized them $1 billion, less than 1% of what they stole, and of that $1 billion, Marsh & McLennan had to pay $800 million of it. Compare that to the recent J.P. Morgan penalty of $425 million for committing IPO frauds related to the dot-com boom, which as of 2003, more than 300 companies admitted to participating in the fraud, with, quote, no adverse effects to our financial results, according to a J.P. Morgan spokesperson. Very interesting. AIG, of course, is the world's largest insurance company. And when I looked into why AIG and Marsh were getting off the hook, I found the nightmare scenario. And to share that with someone who can understand what it amounts to is something that I've worked these past several years to do. You see, it goes like this, but in reverse. In response to Spitzer's investigation, Marsh appoints a new CEO, and that alone struck me as a little strange because of the history behind the investigation. So I did some digging, and since you'll never guess what I found, I'll share it with you. You see, Elliot Spitzer was investigating Marsh, and Marsh countered by replacing their CEO with a guy named Michael Cherkasky, which on the surface seems harmless enough. There's nothing going on here, unless you're a fan of history. You see, AIG CEO Maurice Hammer and Hank Greenberg, who coincidentally was also the former chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and his two sons, Jeff and Evan, who were coincidentally the CEOs of major insurance entities, Marsh & McLennan and ACE Insurance, respectively, were creatively managing their fiscal assets as well as the public representation of those assets. When Spitzer's investigation ramped up, Hank took a golden parachute of hundreds of millions beyond the fraud from AIG, and Jeff stepped down from his post at Marsh & McLennan. But other than that, nothing changed. It was just the right foot switching to the left foot, and the progress of the fraud continues, now with the support of law enforcement. To offer a little contextual history, AIG was founded by OSS operative Cornelius V. Starr, that's 2 R's, the uncle of Bill Clinton's friend Kenneth Starr. AIG was created for and is currently a front which provides cover for intelligence community illicit operations. In 2001, AIG owned a risk management firm called Kroll Associates. Kroll played a major role in the events of September 11th and continues to this day to enable events like the 7/7 and 7/21 bombings in the London tube system. They then go on TV and provide expert counterterrorism testimony to the goldfish at home tuned into Fox News and the like. While Kroll provided the necessary operational capability in part for what was perpetrated on September 11th, AIG and Marsh were focused on participating in both long and short-term money schemes. It's also worth mentioning that Kroll's Jerome Howard, a longtime personal friend of ex-FBI counterterrorism and Osama bin Laden expert John O'Neill, hired O'Neill as the head of security for the World Trade Center just shortly before September 11th. Kroll had also managed the bunker in the World Trade Center 7 for Giuliani, and Kroll's board of directors shared one peculiar member in common with AIG, that being Frank G. Wisner Jr., son of the OSS co-founder, Frank Wisner. I won't go into the history of the OSS, Reinhard Gehlen, or the Council on Foreign Relations' Dulles affiliation with its creation, but I can recommend an excellent book wherein its relevance is comprehensively documented. The title you're looking for is The Old Boys, The American Elite and the Origins of the CIA by Burton Hirsch, printed in 1992. Given the long and distinguished list of residents of the buildings which allegedly fell from fire that day, and the fact that many suspicious trades took place on 9/11 amidst the destruction of Enron evidence, the offices of the Secret Service, the IRS, the CIA, Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management bunker on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7, just to name a few. The question to be asked here is, qui bono? Hundreds of billions in fraudulent transactions took place just prior to the buildings being pulled down on 9/11, not including what I just mentioned about AIG and Marsh previously. These transactions, which capitalized on the destruction of fellow human beings, were also, in part, facilitated by Marsh and McLennan. I know this because they were captured on hard drives, found in the rubble at Ground Zero. A German company called Convar recovered the information on these drives. Where is it today? Well, that's a good question. Google Convar plus Kroll, and you'll see that Kroll coincidentally purchased Convar in June of 2002 to ensure that the evidence never reaches the public mind, or you. On July 8, 2004, Kroll Associates was sold to Marsh & McLennan. I would mention at this point that Kroll Associates also provides kidnap and ransom coverage for major corporations and their executives, and employs ex and current intelligence operatives, as well as ex-Scotland Yard operatives and freelance mercenaries. Kroll is at the heart of 9/11, though it's but a sub-aspect of one of many other superimposed actions and operative details that took place on that day. Like Francis Bacon used to say, here's the rub. Kroll CEO Michael Cherkasky was appointed CEO of Marsh & McLennan, the world's largest insurance broker. In case you're not getting the point, just do a little homework. What you'll find is that Giuliani, Spitzer, Cherkasky, Patrick Fitzgerald, Louis Freeh, and a few other names you'd recognize all used to work for New York District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. And if one were to investigate the history of these particular men in contrast to the events of 9/11, the fraudulent transactions of 9/11, and the destruction of evidence from Ground Zero, one might readily ascertain that these men, though separated geographically, are still very much conspiring behind the scenes. To further demonstrate my contention, I'll offer other suppressed evidence of the February 1993 World Trade Center bombing. A man was instructed by the FBI to place a bomb in the underground parking garage of the North Tower by parking a van laden with military-grade explosives next to a specific column. Said man was suspicious that he was being used, and therefore recorded hundreds of hours of audio wherein he captured the FBI instructing him to do everything that I've just alluded to. It doesn't matter if you believe me. See if you believe yourself when you look it up. Just type in 3 simple words: Salem plus WTC plus recording. What you'll find is a variation of this. Hamid Ali Salem was an FBI informant who used hidden microphones given to him by Federal Bureau of Investigation agents to record his conversations with rogue agents of the Bureau. A Los Angeles Times article on October 28, 1993, revealed to shock readers details of FBI involvement in the terrorist act. But America doesn't read. Yet. Why haven't you heard of this before? Good question. It's easy enough to Google it and find out, but for the sake of continuity, Louis Freeh and Patrick Fitzgerald participated in the cover-up, which, as usual, was perpetrated under the veil of an alleged investigation. You might also notice that Fitzgerald has his hands full these days with an investigation or two. But few are aware that some sources cite that upwards of 100 clandestine operatives under the supervision of Valerie Plame were murdered as a direct result of her cover being blown, admittedly by the current administration, and one might wonder how anyone can keep something like that a secret. I'd suggest that interested parties inquire with Patrick Fitzgerald, or possibly Judith Miller could tell you. She spent 85 days in prison. Maybe she knows something about the cover-up. I would also note the date of her arrest, July 8th, 2005. In any case, now that the president has admitted that he was the one who declassified the information on Ms. Plame, whether or not it was a security leak is a moot point. In fact, it could be an act of treason because in doing so, clandestine agents' covers were also blown, and people who trusted in his leadership and were sworn to protect us died at the hands of enemies of the United States because of his comments, all for some political defense against other lies that the administration told to deceive America into becoming a dictatorial empire. I think it's time that we all took a deep look to see whose actions exactly, in fact, are providing aid to the terrorists. Don't you? More to the point, Elliot Spitzer was brought into the New York City District Attorney's Office years ago by Michael Cherkasky, who also happens to be a major contributor to Spitzer's campaign. Who's running for New York governor? Elliot Spitzer. Who's Spitzer allegedly investigating? Marcia McLennan, whose CEO is Michael Cherkasky. Now, there's a lot more I could share, but right now I think that I should continue to build out the context of how and why I know what I know. As I think that in this case, how I found out is as important as what I eventually found. By the end of the week following September 11th, I was on a plane to San Francisco to meet with a potential employer who entertained me on September 7th at Windows on the World in the North Tower. I was interested in working for this company because they too were involved, as Silverstream was, in the realm of providing cutting-edge internet technology to financial institutions. Despite the fact that Silverstream had terminated me in retaliation, the same chief financial officer who attempted to buy my silence actively sought to prevent my securing new employment by threatening to sue my potential employer. And with that, I was back at square one. At the time of 9/11, I was renting a duplex on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I had two roommates, one Pakistani and one Indian. Both were British citizens. I knew them because the Pakistani gentleman was a client of Silverstream, and he was the head of emerging technologies for Deutsche Bank. He led me into a company called Panacea, P-A-N-A-C-Y-A, where I started to work in November 2001 as the director of sales for financial services. At the time, Deutsche Bank was in the midst of a project called Blue Sky, which had a budget of approximately $200 million, and Panacea was one of the technologies in contention for part of the contract. The Panacea product, called Be Aware, was the confluence between artificial intelligence and systems monitoring software, whereby it could be applied to observe a given environment and actually learn in a variety of ways, either through learned behavior based on observation and interaction, or encapsulated instructions conditioned by an authoritative source. This learning and real-time observation was then compared against both real-time and historical information, the function of performance, of course, being dependent on the validity of the history which the software references to make its decisions. Based on these premises, the software can be applied to a system wherein it begins to learn, and parallel agents remotely observe the environment, share information in a peer-to-peer manner, and acclimate, both as a group and individually, to become a virtually decentralized network which produces quality intelligence. When a software agent matures, it is said to graduate, and in that state can actively and accurately predict critical events before they occur, and has the ability to take preemptive action, either learned or conditioned behaviors to prevent critical events from affecting clients or transactions. Of course, if the agent is cut off from its authoritative components, it can only collect and store information until it reconnects with the authoritative engine whereby action can be taken. Allow me to restate that. The software gives the user the ability to predict critical events in the applied environment before they occur for the purpose of taking preemptive action. In simplest terms, the Panacea product could be applied to any information technology architecture, monitor every aspect of that architecture, actively learn what makes it go critical or crash, and then consistently predict pending crashes so that they could be fixed before they occurred and costly downtime was encountered. Here's a practical use. Let's say a client of mine, Fidelity, processes $500 million worth of transactions on a particular server per hour. What is the cost of that server being down for an hour or a day? How much is it worth to a corporation to be able to prevent losing $500 million worth of transactions? And that's just the savings realized from preventing 1 hour of downtime. Given that, I would ask this question. If software this powerful is being openly offered commercially, are we to believe that our intelligence community doesn't have software at least this powerful? And under that supposition that they indeed do, is it not fair to assume that the intelligence community was at the very least aware of some sort of impending critical event prior to 9/11. After all, in hindsight, the administration itself has offered forth numerous memos and warnings that were received prior to 9/11. In fact, in many instances, these memos and/or warnings were used as a basis of action by the current administration. But unfortunately for the American people, the actions taken were not to warn the people of impending danger, but rather to capitalize on a tragedy, as the fraudulent transactions can be tracked back to intelligence community executives responsible for the protection of our own country. I would also mention at this point that the information technology systems used by our intelligence community became a virtual scapegoat post 9/11 under the guise of, quote, intelligence failures, wherein they claimed that 9/11 was a result of the intelligence agencies allegedly not being able to effectively share information across organizations. In fact, the information systems and software tasked with preserving the security of our country performed without fail, and all of the, quote, failures were choreographed and contrived so as to present the illusion which served as the propulsion mechanism through which the intelligence community could be brought under the control of one man by creating a position called Director of National Intelligence, a position currently occupied by John Negroponte. Just look him up in Wikipedia if you're not making a connection between the position of Director of National Intelligence and the 9/11 Commission recommendations. Lastly on this topic, I would mention that the FBI recently had a $250 million software project to integrate their systems. And interestingly, like many projects of this kind, it was suspiciously canceled, but only after receiving approval and funding. Where does all the money go? Hopefully that'll sink in if it hasn't already, but I'll move on. Panacea was developed in Annapolis, in the Naval Yard. Their office at the time of my being there was on the border of Fort George G. Meade, Maryland, which of course is the National Security Agency. And the current Chief Technology Officer of Panacea is an NSA operative. As you probably know, the NSA is not just one building in Maryland. It's numerous private companies like Computer Sciences Corporation and DynCorp, to whom much of the processing of the data collected on the public is outsourced by the NSA. You could even say to ensure plausible denial. So in actuality, I'm sure it's not a shock to you if I relate that there are many companies through which the intelligence community operates. And like, for instance, AIG, these companies in some cases are household names and openly traded on the stock market. I was at Panacea for about a year and a half, and I learned a lot about what the software industry was really about. I worked with guys from, for instance, NASA, JPL, Oak Ridge, in other words, real-life rocket scientists. Guys who, for instance, worked on recent Mars missions. Guys who held multiple patents on some highly interesting and profound ideas. And it's worth mentioning that the NSA doesn't have a secret relationship with AT&T and GTE and all the other telephone companies, because they are the telephone companies. And there's a 1996 regulation wherein approximately $10 billion of U.S. taxpayer money was used to modernize and upgrade the NSA's ability to monitor, process, and or record every single telephone interaction that goes on anywhere in the country, to say the least. Also worth mentioning, a Panacea-like product is used to analyze and determine risk by processing the aforementioned calls in the context of other data collected. In a face-to-face meeting, I'd be happy to explain the variety of ways that rogue corporations collect, analyze, profile, archive, and sell the private information of Americans, but for that, I'll need a whiteboard, some colored markers, and your undivided attention, because it's a brilliant plan to protect the people, right up to the point where it's misused by rogue forces to undermine the Constitution and the privacy rights of Americans. One of my mentors at this time was the creator of key components of the Panacea Artificial Intelligence and Learning Engines, a man who participated in the creation of something called the Relational Database as part of a government project called Oracle. His work on fuzzy logic is evolutionary, and his book, Beyond Humanity, Cyber Evolution and Future Minds, was used by Steven Spielberg in defining the futuristic environment of the film AI. Needless to say, it was about the same time while working at Panacea that I was really starting to figure out the nuts and bolts of what 9/11 really was, as well as how and why it was perpetrated. You see, on the morning of 9/11, I witnessed activities involving vehicles which I identified as being intelligence-related entities. I based this instant association on the fact that when I worked in McLean, Virginia in 1998, before moving to New York City in 1999, I knew of vehicles identically disguised as those I saw being used at Ground Zero. Specifically, an identical counterpart of one of the vehicles used to be stationed at the gate of the Central Intelligence Agency during times of heightened terrorist awareness in the Washington, D.C. area. For me, it became obvious only a few minutes after the South Tower explosion that the vehicles and personnel I was observing at Ground Zero were not there to help or rescue people. But I'm getting off topic. The bottom line is that I saw enough that morning before the South Tower explosion to be suspicious. And what I saw occur during and after the South Tower explosion was enough to know that I had no control over the situation and that entities much more powerful than me were in control of whatever was going on. Likewise to the aforementioned identification of clandestine vehicles. Without the revelations, which were revealed to me by my work at Panacea, I would never have been able to solve the puzzle of 9/11 or understand what the solution meant. Interestingly enough, I had managed to assemble a comprehensive picture of why 9/11 was launched without suffering any visible adverse consequences. And that came to a swift end within hours of my saving the last files necessary, from my perspective, to demonstrate that the official story was really an official lie. I had created a model wherein I connected the various aspects of participants and profiteers of 9/11, and this model was comprehensive in nature, so comprehensive that when I searched on the final entities involved, I apparently unwittingly identified myself to those who surely do not want to be known to the public. Unfortunately, those who I was monitoring and investigating with relation to the 9/11 money laundering finally caught on that I was on the inside, because I too was being monitored. I was using company resources for personal research, and by that, I mean that I was repurposing information systems during my free time. That's not to say that I wasn't doing my job, I was, but the result was the same. I had made waves, those waves were picked up by elements of the intelligence community, and apparently I was marked as a threat of some sort. On December 24th, 2002, my apartment was burglarized, and by this time I was living with my current fiancée in New York, but we were spending Christmas in Connecticut. When we returned on the 27th, everything seemed fine. And then I started to notice odd things missing. And most peculiar about the situation was that the only items that were missing were items which were hidden, items which only a professional could find, and indeed had. Once we secured the apartment, we called the police and filed a report, and at the time I had let my insurance lapse, so there was no insurance to collect. And besides, some of the items taken weren't exactly things that you list on your insurance policy, but let's suffice to say that when someone invades your home and steals your measures of security and your research only, it sends a message that it wasn't a normal burglary. That and the fact that there was easily $100,000 worth of defensible loot lying around in the apartment. But the only items taken were items which pertained to my investigation of 9/11. My company laptop, my video camera which I had with me on the morning of September 11th, my global cell phone, and all of my disaster recovery copies of my data. Well, almost all of them. Nevertheless, whoever removed these assets now had copies of my research, all of my email, all of my telephone records, and the names of all of my family, friends, acquaintances, and business colleagues. Couple that with the fact that the NYPD detectives confirmed that the perpetrators apparently used keys, which made it even more unusual and unsettling, as if it were possibly a sneak and peek search of sorts. The NYPD detectives that visited numerous times mentioned there might be something beyond their realm and advised me that I should leave certain details out of my report. Perhaps someone with Patriot Act authority went to my landlord who helped them gain entry. Interestingly enough, when we were forced into Exodus in 2003, the same landlord saw fit to cheat us out of our $7,000 security deposit. And ironically, he admitted to this on tape and was knowingly defrauding us openly. Why would he take such an opportunity to kick us when we were down after I had paid him over $100,000 in rent during my stay in New York? Possibly because he knew that due to the nature of the situation, every opportunity was being explored to financially break me, and so he was just doing his part to serve the terrorists. It was only days after the surreptitious invasion and theft that on January 16, 2003, I was terminated by Panacea, probably in no small part due to what was found on the devices removed from my apartment. I would also offer that I plausibly ruffled some feathers when I refused to progress what started out as an 8-figure deal with General Electric, who was interested in predicting the future, at least with respect to their information systems environment. I was asked by Panacea executives to misrepresent our financial viability and make certain guarantees to GE, which went against my better judgment. You see, the sources of Panacea funding were kept secret, at least from me, and believe me, I tried to find out who was running this operation because it was a mess, and I naively thought that the investors would care about so much money being wasted on a daily basis by non-revenue producing tasks. In any case, my reluctance to blatantly lie to GE's top executives was the reason in my mind at the time for my untimely and unwarranted termination, as I did not verify the NSA affiliations with Panacea until after my termination. Coincidentally, simultaneous to my second unexpected termination, my financial viability was now being brought into question. It started with American Express, and although I had a verbal agreement with them to pay in full the expenses which I had been left hanging with after such an abrupt termination, my account was closed, and they called for me to pay off my card in full immediately. I had a contract with a human, and now I was being told that a computer had made the most recent decision. Though I had spent several $100,000 with American Express since relocating to New York City, and had accrued almost 500,000 Amex miles, I was disavowed and no person was to blame. Again, the computer was being used as a scapegoat, because if it were an honest mistake, it would have been corrected, and not used as a convenient reason to coercively attempt to force my silence. Why would American Express alienate a customer in good standing, and then become aggressive in response? At this point, I don't even know what I had done, but I was starting to suspect that all these events were connected by something I did not yet fully comprehend. American Express and its creditors altered my credit rating, and like that, I was out. MBNA and Citibank then followed suit and closed my accounts using similar tactics. And as the ultimate irony, at least at the time, all those who blacklisted me were also involved in the 9/11 frauds which I had documented on some level. Perhaps upon inspection of my research, they decided they should no longer fund me in my efforts. You see, at the time, I was using money borrowed from them to fund my research into 9/11 and how they profited from 9/11. So it seemed like a fair deal to me. Apparently they disagreed. As coincidence would again have it, you might notice that Louis Freeh is the current chairman of Mercedes-Benz North America, better known as MBNA, and John Deutsch, former director of Central Intelligence, is currently on the board of Citibank, and both financial entities are associated with events before, during, and after 9/11. At this point, I stepped back to take a look at the landscape of what was going on because I had obviously fallen behind the curve somehow, and I needed to figure out a way to skip ahead. So I used the opportunity provided by yet another unexpected unemployment and used the time to design a future of my own, one which was independent of the greed of others. And while I had a large savings at the time, it was being rapidly depleted due to standing obligations that remained from my life in sales. But also at the time, it seemed much more important to me to find out what was really going on, rather than to cling to material possessions. So I started selling off my assets to counter the weight of my obligations, just in case. I continued researching what was going on in the world around me, and I observed how rogue corporate engagement is disintegrating our society. And in response to what I learned, I designed several different business plans, both for-profit and not-for-profit entities, which operate in a complementary relationship. One organization's profits are used to fund the other organization's philanthropic ventures, whether it be public education and entertainment, child and adult literacy services, reintegration of the homeless into society, or ad hoc financial support for those in need. All of these entities were designed to complement for-profit media and entertainment business model components, and are currently held under the name of Renaissance Interventures. In one particular model, I was taking what I witnessed in the business world and leveraging the inefficiencies of technology sales organizations and corporate purchasing organizations, wherein an agency can act as a broker, save both sides money, and clear a legitimate profit. This profit could then be used for uniting the public via education for the public mind, or to otherwise be used to help people learn, to help themselves and others. I won't expound upon the ideas here, but they are unique. They kind of make people do a double take, because it's a, why didn't I think of that kind of moment? As irony would again have it, I then discovered the reason that my ideas were so revolutionary. You see, with so much entropy that I had identified being accumulated on both sides of the sales cycle, between technology companies and commercial corporations, the potential for legitimate savings and therefore legitimate profit was immense. So why was I the one discovering this opportunity? Well, the excitement was short-lived, as it would later be pointed out to me by an expert on the subject that there was no opportunity to be had, because the profits I planned to reap were already spoken for, so to speak. The entropy was simply a necessary illusion created to launder large amounts of illicit black market funds. At the time, I legitimately felt that I should wait for the 9/11 Commission to investigate and present their findings, as I had hoped that enough people were aware of the frauds being perpetrated, all of which were using 9/11 as an excuse. So I continued to quietly observe until I identified who was really trying to find the truth. Simultaneously, my fiancée identified laundering activities within her work environment, at Oracle Corporation, and was given the option to resign or forget about what she had witnessed. To make a long story short, she was terminated in retaliation for blowing the whistle as well. And since it would have been illegal for Oracle to terminate her in a straightforward manner, Oracle concocted a story wherein they claimed that my fiancée verbally resigned, without any paperwork, 2 months before they called her to inform her of her last day. Her case currently resides in the federal court system of the Southern District in New York. Needless to say, in light of these revelations, in June of 2003 I took a job at a software company called Legato, which traditionally provided information storage and disaster recovery solutions, but specifically, they sold a compliance product which was allegedly working to prevent opportunities wherein money laundering and other types of accounting fraud could be exploited and perpetrated by corporations. You see, there was a methodology to my choice of employers, and my interest in disaster recovery was twofold. I was interested in the activity of corporate financial entities who just happened to complete disaster recovery plans suspiciously close to the events of 9/11. Talk about having an advantage over competition. Look at the insurance companies who survived post 9/11 and those who were eaten up and crushed by it. At the time, I was also interested in preserving my own evidence, and so I wanted to find out how the enemy performed such necessary measures of ensuring that their data survived cataclysmic events. At Legato, I was focused on selling products which supported the prevention of accounting fraud and preservation of transactional records by way of document lifecycle management and backup storage solutions. And to offer a sample of my client base, I was responsible for DynCorp, Northrop Grumman, Tyco International, WorldCom, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and otherwise held a client base of banks, insurance companies, and government contractors. After only a few weeks of working at Legato, one of the many novel discoveries that I made was that the Sarbanes-Oxley Law, enacted in 2002 to prevent frauds like those of Tyco, Enron, and WorldCom, regardless of its intended purpose and creation, was now being enforced as a protection scheme rather than an enforcement directive, wherein a corporation was required by the SEC and NASD regulations to purchase a compliant solution, and those who were in violation of this regulation were subject to penalty and investigation. And in fact, the security being offered was an illusion, because you see there are loopholes in the compliance solutions that Legato offered, as I soon also found out. I discovered that the Legato compliance software product has multiple backdoors where a client could actually delete documents and transactions. So in essence, the use of the product doesn't prevent the corruption or deletion of documents as it's supposed to. Rather, it assists in the perpetration and cover-up and makes it harder for anyone to identify and or investigate it, because the software creates a layer of corruptible abstraction. So in simplest terms, the law which is supposed to prevent these frauds from proliferating is ironically being used to help criminals better conceal their crimes, completely obliterating the product security and viability in the marketplace. I only discovered this because the Chief General Counsel of Tyco International told me that she wanted to destroy the audit trails and documents, not preserve them. And I'm quoting her. And I guess it struck me because I was there to help them preserve documents as they were under SEC investigation at the time. Silly me. In a similarly eye-opening experience, an executive at the NASD validated the possibility of deleting documents within the software as well. And my superiors were in that meeting but didn't seem surprised or concerned, and they certainly didn't take any action. It was all being done on the square, so to speak, so it was okay that Legato was engaging in selling a pseudo product which provided the same security provided by any other placebo. In other words, like the war on terror, it's just the illusion of security, with a several $100,000 or several $1 trillion price tag. The products I'm not mentioning by name are used by, for example, Deutsche Bank, John Hancock, and several pharmaceutical giants, and the accounting integrity of those companies and many others depends on the Legato product, which is, as I mentioned, the cleverly priced illusion of security, one which most likely is making those companies more vulnerable by investing in pseudo-solutions. I was also ordered by my superiors at Legato to engage in the forgery of documents, which were to be used to convince a company called EMC Corporation to purchase Legato at an exorbitantly generous price. This was being ordered by Legato executives as one of many measures taken to manipulate and artificially inflate corporate financial projections and records being reviewed as part of the acquisition process, for the purpose of artificially inflating the purchase price by approximately 100% over EMC's initial offer to $1.3 billion. EMC Corporation purchased Legato on July 8, 2003, 1 year to the day before Kroll was purchased by Marsh. EMC, in the case that you're not familiar, is an alleged competitor of IBM and provides hardware and data storage, among other things, as I found out. In August of 2003, I found out that one of my clients, DynCorp, was engaged in the international sex slave trade, selling women and children in various parts of the world for the purposes of prostitution, slavery, and use in snuff films wherein they are murdered for entertainment. Search on the United Nations plus DynCorp, and you may find that DynCorp was convicted of having sold over 200,000 women and children through its black market slave trade, and that's only a fraction of the illicit business they've done over the past several years. Coincidentally, DynCorp is also partially responsible for Pentagon accounting, which led to the $2.3 trillion announced missing on September 10, 2001. What's more, DynCorp is responsible for the anthrax and smallpox vaccines injected into our unsuspecting and trusting troops. And DynCorp is currently placing mercenaries around the world, collecting tens of billions in U.S. taxpayer dollars via dirty contracts. And in the spring of 2006, DynCorp began staffing U.S. sheriff's offices. I was reprimanded several times for expressing concerns over what were obviously illicit dealings. I was coerced and threatened into taking a boat ride out on Long Island Sound with my boss so that he could literally make the point that I shouldn't be rocking the boat and that I should stop making waves. Shortly after that, the money ran out. Legato had initially promised me a better paying position and a moving package to get out of the city when I accepted the job, but through a game of bait and switch, Legato delivered neither. I was forced to move out of my apartment in New York, and on September 11, 2003, my fiancé and I hastily moved to Princeton, New Jersey, where I'd lived back in early 1997. I continued patiently working under duress and intimidation, and then, in September of 2003, the SEC arrested a Legato client from a subsidiary of Northrop Grumman for his illicit sales contracts with Legato, and I continued to request purchasing and license information on this and other accounts for which I was held responsible. Yet the information on the purchases was conveniently missing. Those involved with the illicit dealings took numerous steps to coercively deal with me, undermine me, and contrive situations wherein I could be easily and unwittingly terminated. I was then told by Legato management that they, quote, don't have the resources to save or share this data, end quote. It doesn't exist. Referencing several months of data that I could get my hands on, I found that on average, out of, for example, 4,000 transactions per month, approximately 1,000 of those transactions, or 25%, were lacking some, if not all, of the required information through which they could be legitimately claimed as recognizable revenue as per GAAP accounting regulations. I then found more and more, and I started putting two and two together. I had evidence that defense contractors and banks in particular were plausibly using software purchases to cloak laundering activities, and now I had the evidence necessary to connect the dots. You see, I forgot to mention earlier in this saga that once I figured out what was going on with respect to 9/11, I really started covering my back, so to speak, insofar as, for lack of a more subtle phrase, I started wearing a wire, and I started documenting everything, and distributing copies of everything to various undisclosed locations where they could lie dormant in case of emergency. It was my contention then, as it is now, that the mass chaos perpetrated today is only prevalent due to the veil provided by anonymity. And by that same assertion, if one were to remove that veil of anonymity and reveal the inner workings of these organizations to the public, well then I thought maybe someone in the future might find my documentation valuable as an objectively real contextual history of the events of the early 21st century. At the very least, it was my version of a disaster recovery plan in the case that I met with some ill fate during my search. People would have every detail of what led me up to that point, who I was observing, and what I thought. And in a worst-case scenario, barring the destruction of the planet, virtual time capsules containing my archives will survive to communicate this story to a future audience, as the matters at hand must at the very least be communicated for the benefit of posterity, but only in the case that I did not survive to propagate and explain these documents and files myself. I also adopted a policy of recording the 24-hour news networks to DVD 18 hours a day, as a complementary measure to document contextual media events against the background of our research. I started recording initially to preserve my study of the world situation, geopolitically, culturally, and socioeconomically, and what stuck in my mind was Nazi Germany, and the similarity between the deceptions used on the German public and than those being used on the American populace. As a policy, I started recording to contextually document my daily work and to preserve our journey in ongoing revelations and correlations of evidence on Memorex, so that one could potentially go back and review any or all of my days of study and judge for themselves. Having personally invested over 10,000 hours searching, researching, and investigating in the hidden forces that shape our world and our daily lives, and considering that common thread led straight through to the origins and aftermath of 9/11, recording was the most cost-effective way to preserve our studies for future evaluation. That being said, when my fiancé started having problems at Oracle, I was already well into this policy of contextually recording our daily work, and Oracle's executives were accidentally captured in the midst of it all. Coincidentally, at that same time, in April of 2003, I had in my hands evidence of hundreds of thousands of dollars being funneled to offshore private accounts from a company who was a partner of Oracle Corporation. This Oracle partner in crime was led by two British expatriates who were exiled after similar frauds to that which I observed in the spring of 2003. For example, they were charging Oracle clients for services that were not actually being rendered, and they were collecting taxes on Oracle software being sold, but failing to pass those taxes on to the government. This particular Oracle partner was also claiming bankruptcy and under a supposed audit, yet was wiring large sums of money to private offshore accounts. One of the men responsible was surnamed Sheikh, and at the time there was supposedly a high awareness and interest in potential vehicles for Islamic terrorist funding, or at least that's what the media was telling us at the time. And so I decided to test the waters, and my first call was to the Department of Homeland Security. They weren't interested. And then I tried the IRS, and then the Treasury Department. They likewise expressed lackluster interest. Something was wrong. I couldn't figure out why the people who were allegedly hunting for the machinations of the terrorist funding weren't interested in possible and plausible instances of that type of breach in the system. I started to think that maybe the Islamist extremist terrorists were actually the shadow cast by a more wily and less obvious organization, or that possibly Al-Qaeda was not really made up of Islamic extremists at all, but rather quite the opposite. And the sad truth is, the evidence points to corporate fundamentalists who were using the Muslim population as a scapegoat which depends on total media control and the conditioned, stereotypically driven responses from the masses to bomb them back to the Stone Age. Indeed. So hopefully, if you haven't already, you'll start to smell the hypocrisy in the media and the administration's official story. And when I looked further into these events, they seem to head toward a synthetic confluence, where the two become one and the sum becomes the whole. You see, a shadow is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object. And in order to find the source which casts the shadow, one must go to the base from which the shadow is cast. Al-Qaeda is the shadow cast by elements of the intelligence community, and Al-Qaeda means the base. Al-Qaeda takes its name from a database file wherein information on miscellaneous terrorists was filed for future classification. The idea of imprisoning the people in a dark cave and using fire to cast shadows to keep the people in fear is a callback to Plato's allegory of the cave. So you see, to those playing tricks on all of us, it's all some sort of demented inside joke, but only to those of us who are on the outside and see the shadows for what they are. For everyone else, it's real and terrifying, and that's what makes it deadly for everyone involved. Think about how we're all conditioned to believe that the truth hurts, when in fact, fear is used to keep us from its innate comfort. As you might also be aware, Osama bin Laden was trained in the United States by U.S. intelligence agencies and sponsored by U.S. taxpayer dollars. But there are few aware that his code name was Tim Osman, OSS man. Get it? And you see, there are quite a few of these twisted little side jokes sewn into the fabric of this ongoing fraud.
Okay, by now I'm sure you're pretty breathless with the information that you're hearing. I know that I was totally astounded by it. And again, I'm pleased to be the first person to have the courage to give this man any credibility, but this story is unbelievable. So I'm going to continue with the rest of it, and then, of course, I will eventually have him on the show live, if we're all still alive after airing this. I'm going to go to a short break, then I'm going to put the rest of his information out there. Okay, we're listening to whistleblower Richard Andrew Grove, a real gutsy guy who has lost everything in favor of the truth. So I'm not even going to interrupt it. I'm just going to give you some more of what he has to say.
Through the integration of new data, my hindsight was optimized, and to my dismay, I discovered that I had, in fact, worked for and among people who had participated in aspects of planning, perpetrating, and or profiting from both the attacks and the aftermath. Whether it was using scare tactics to get corporations to buy into disaster recovery or compliance solutions in order to avoid another Enron or Tyco type of scandal, or the choreography necessary to carry out a die-hard with a vengeance-like heist, and then contrive 2 wars wherein they get to sell more military security and technological apparatuses. And mind you, I was figuring this out while I was working inside of one of the largest technology entities on the planet, EMC Corporation. In light of the nature of the activities and the people I was investigating, and in the face of having no authoritative structure which was legitimately trying to discover what really happened on 9/11, my routine of recording my environment consistently was intended as a contextual historical dataset from which an observer could actively listen into the reality of the past, not just the propagandized version preserved by Hearst and Murdoch. I felt justified in doing so under these circumstances because I was putting my neck out on the line to see how the rivers of currency flowed. And ironically, I found it's all being directed by the banks. And as one may readily see through this perspective, a lot of money was made and stolen during the calamity that we know as 9/11. As I continued my work at Legato in October of 2003, it became apparent that a variety of schemes were being proliferated through EMC and Legato. And by that time, I'd already captured multiple instances of voice-recorded acts of fraud, coercion, and cover-up, because much of both EMC and Legato's business was done over the phone. My manager especially enjoyed espousing his ego openly over conference calls, and in one case threatened physical violence against a competing EMC manager in several instances over the span of a week. Still being just a bit naive at this time, thinking that EMC was being defrauded by Legato, I took evidence to EMC and expressed concerns that Legato was cheating clients, the U.S. government, and EMC investors. I found out, albeit the hard way, that EMC was fully aware and approving of the schemes in progress. And plausibly, that was EMC's main objective in acquiring Legato, to inherit the maturing bevy of frauds and schemes. You see, that's what goes on, and while many may be aware that approximately $1 trillion in black market funds are laundered through our stock market every year, few are aware how it's done. Evidence demonstrates that technology companies are used in part to obfuscate the process of laundering from the public eye. In my experience, as captured on Memorex, demonstrates that factions of the authorities charged to investigate and prosecute are, in fact, acting to protect and allow such blatantly syndicated and proliferated frauds to exist and to profit toward a market-crashing event. Now, I could draw you a model, but of course you couldn't see it from there, but basically, one could plausibly use enterprise software companies to launder huge amounts of drug money internationally, and that's because much of what you're selling is an illusion. A great deal of the commercial technology made available on the street today is a cheaply derived cousin of its more potent intelligence community software counterparts. And in a good deal of cases, the development was already paid for in part by U.S. taxpayer contributions. The software community in many cases then minimally adapts this software for commercial use and derives an arbitrarily decided sum of money for it. You see, I could sell you a CD with the same code for either $10,000 or $10 million. There's no difference. There are no boundaries. The technology industry is like the Wild West in that it's practically unchecked in every way and exploited by the few with the hidden knowledge and the secret affiliations to those in power. Are you starting to recognize why the gray area of verifying the worth of transactions becomes so important? If one were a character of questionable integrity, and that character was, for instance, the CEO of a large software corporation with ties to a corrupt administration and a huge opportunity to launder illicit funds without being caught by authorities, which seems more logical? That this fictional character is loyal to his or her clients, employees, investors, etc., and would sidestep easy money opportunities that come their way? Or would said character exploit the opportunity to the fullest degree, possibly to the point of being caught? Because the precedents set recently clearly demonstrate that little or nothing happens to you when you launder the right people's money. Could this process not then be duplicated across multiple enterprise software organizations? A syndicated network of such organizations could readily launder hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars annually. Do you suppose that those organizations would focus on solving technology problems for clients, or simply progress software to legitimately do business while laundering money? We live in a capitalist society which is more profitable. The enterprise software industry is part and parcel with the Sullivan and Cromwell phenomenon, wherein the Wall Street bankers created the intelligence community and the Council on Foreign Relations. And in contemporary terms, it's still all the same scheme. It's called the stock market, wherein every publicly traded entity is a possible mechanism to launder dirty transactions without investors being any the wiser. And if the American people do not stand up and demand change and reform, the market and the dollar will crash, and along with it, America as we've known it. These days, the Wall Street venture capitalists capitalize on the ignorance of the internet trading and investing community, and they pull the plug on the stocks as they please. One such venture company is called Veritas Capital, which now owns DynCorp. Search DynCorp plus UN plus guilty plus sex to see what they're investing in. But to give you a hint, it's the ironic epitome of the truth. But the perfect example is Oracle Corporation, wherein they enlisted Morgan Stanley .com guru Charles Phillips to overhype its stock, and when the dot-bomb market crashes, as the bubble was a contrived scheme from the start, Oracle in return rewards Phillips with the position of president of Oracle, that is. Google is a whole .com investment scheme condensed into one stock, and it's an investor's nightmare waiting to happen. Google is also an intelligence community experiment which captures and caches your information until the year 2038. Getting back to software companies, they literally print their own money. And if that makes you think of Bill Gates or Larry Ellison, it certainly should, as both Microsoft and Oracle were Pentagon projects turned commercial. Aside from the software companies and the Federal Reserve bankers, the only other company who's allowed to print international currency that I know of is American Express. Getting to where the rubber meets the road, here are a few points that might pique your interest, or at the very least, provide a novel perspective through which to observe the 9/11 landscape. In 2000 and 2001, the SEC had investigated Legato, and in response, Legato appointed a new CEO. Sound familiar? I later discovered that this CEO had fraudulently claimed an MBA degree, as I took the trouble to fact-check his background and verify this with the registrar of the college in question. There's also an interesting connection to an insurance company and Citibank in this story, but this is neither the time nor the place to share that. The point is that this same CEO who falsified his experience and was brought in to clean up Legato's accounting also signed his company correspondence with "Let's Roll," the phrase allegedly made famous by Todd Beamer on Flight 93. Coincidentally, Todd Beamer's father was the chief financial officer at Legato, working directly for the CEO who signs his company correspondence, "Let's Roll." On a side note, my fiancé worked with Todd Beamer, as they were both in sales at Oracle. David Beamer has recently stated that he does not like people to use this phrase in remembrance of Flight 93. So why would he allow Legato's CEO to use it repetitively in meaningless emails? It seems a little more than strange when you get down to the details. One might also find it interesting that EMC's founder, Richard Egan, was Dick Cheney's largest fundraiser in 2000, and was appointed by George W. Bush as ambassador to Ireland in his first term. Coincidence? Only if you're missing the information which connects them all. In October of 2003, I went to the SEC and I was told that they weren't able to help me. They further advised me that I would be, quote, better off if I did not share my evidence with them. A few months later, the SEC purchased the Legato product for compliance. And this is of note because I explained to them specifically that the Legato product was verifiably not secure, and that their data would be at risk. So basically, the authoritative integrity of key aspects of the most trusted entities in our stock market enforcement have been demonstrably compromised. In seeking to suppress all that I've revealed thus far, they're a necessary part of the protection scheme, selective enforcement, but only for those who don't fall in line or pay the price of protection. I mean, buy the software. At this point, to be candid, I was more than a little disillusioned with everything I'd experienced. I hadn't yet made all the connections, but being a kid who grew up in Beaver, Pennsylvania, and had only experienced New York by way of Hollywood until I went there for work, I had no idea how corrupt the business world truly was. Granted, my high school did have a history teacher who was Oliver North's personal secretary during Iran-Contra, so I had heard stories, but I didn't realize the level of deception actually in practice out there until I was already in the middle of it. and that's not necessarily the best place to become aware of such dangers. In any case, I eventually learned to leverage this disillusionment and find resolution and patience, and coupled with discipline, I started to find the real answers. After all, I figured, what else is life for if not to live as free people, and to express our minds for the purpose of living in reality, not some homage to Orwell's 1984, where newspeak rules and thought is a crime. I was terminated by EMC Corporation on January 15th, 2004, which was 1 year to the day after my last illegal termination. This was done in retaliation for my blowing the whistle on November 4th, 2003 to EMC's Human Resources Department, whose executive vice president not only ignored my request for guidance and asylum, but in doing so failed to provide protections guaranteed to me by law. Keep in mind, I had attempted to inform everyone from the chairman and CEO on down inside of EMC, including the chairman of the Sarbanes-Oxley mandated EMC Governance Audit Committee, Paul Fitzgerald. In retaliation for doing what I thought was right in a tough situation, I was shut out, alienated, and slandered to both my co-workers and clients. And what I did not get was an opportunity to speak with EMC's Human Resources Department about my concerns. Ever. Instead, my clients were given away to those named in my complaint, and my health insurance was cut off. By the time January 15th rolled around, it had been almost a month since anyone at EMC had communicated with me. Then I received a voicemail from one of the managers named in my complaint, and when I returned the call to this particular manager who was based in Georgia, my call was surreptitiously forwarded to a Legato HR manager in Maryland, who curtly informed me that I was being terminated for cause. When I inquired as to the meaning of cause, the representative responded with, for reasons. On April 13, 2004, I contacted the United States Department of Labor, OSHA, and filed a Sarbanes-Oxley claim, as I had irrefutable evidence that EMC violated this act, and ironically, EMC now owned Legato, which sold the Sarbanes-Oxley compliance solutions to others, but did not use it themselves. In essence, I presented the United States Department of Labor with a catch-22 of sorts, which is why what was supposed to be a 60-day investigation has now taken over 2 years and counting. Most likely, there's a conflict of interest somewhere in the chain of authority, as if they find I have no merit, they run the risk that I'll go public with evidence I haven't even referred to here. While if they find my claims do have merit, then EMC is going to be in a fix, because you can't legitimately investigate the company founded by the largest fundraiser of the vice president, in light of the fact that he's also connected to the president. And EMC crimes would connect them both to numerous counts of federal violations and frauds which are ongoing. As you may relate, it was upon this realization myself whereby I decided that we needed to take this to the next level and try to get this information out to the public. Now, if one were really interested in seeing what should rightfully concern those supporting the administration in power, one could search on the patterns of the IMF and the World Bank lending money to poor nations who can't afford to pay it back, and in a similar tactic as credit card companies canvassing at colleges creating indentured servants, the IMF and World Bank focus on undermining and bankrupting those countries, simultaneously spawning the spontaneous creation of resorts and hotels to lure in sexual predators, clients and tourists. I would note here that one of the authors of the Project for a New American Century is now the chairman of the World Bank. Being that Wolfowitz has worked in the White House since the 70s, it should be no surprise to anyone who knows their history. Or, one might make the connection to today's human trafficking crisis via the front cover of the June 29, 1989 Washington Times, whereby said connections to the White House and sex slave trade and the Oracle of Omaha are made clear, noting the connection to the president's visit to Omaha on September 11th, when Buffett was holding his last annual golf tournament. Coincidence? Again, only if you're not familiar with U.S. history. Just because it's not served up by corporate mass media in a nice, neat little package without any loose ends and no homework doesn't mean that it's not newsworthy or, in fact, suppressed history. In May of 2004, my fiancé and I watched a film called The Insider, wherein Al Pacino plays an investigative journalist named Lowell Bergman. In an attempt to reach out to someone who had both the resources to validate and disseminate the information I collected, I faxed Bergman, exactly as whistleblower John Wigand did in the film, and Bergman responded, just as Pacino does in the film. A week later, he had 2 editors handling our individual stories, my fiancé's with Oracle and mine with EMC. We didn't trust Bergman 100%, so we were testing him out with some of the less controversial aspects of what we had discovered. It did not at any time show him all of our cards, which was especially easy, considering his interaction with us was kept at a distance through his editors. After about a year of working with Bergman's people, one of the editors lost his job while investigating our story. The other editor was pressured to drop his story by his San Francisco newspaper, at which time Bergman promptly canceled our contract via his assistant after holding us to confidentiality for over a year. I guess he's just too busy going to World Economic Forums and financial summits to live up to his reputation as one of the last of a dying breed of investigative journalists. On July 8, 2004, a manuscript I wrote received its copyright under the title Manifest Destiny. A story of a group of friends who discover the dark truths of 9/11 and then come together to present the divisive ideas to the public via a variety of novel communication and entertainment ventures. As only coincidence could have it, Marcia McLennan purchased Kroll Associates on the same day, and ironically, Manifest Destiny's villains bear a striking resemblance to the aforementioned company's roles played in the 9/11 fraud on the American people. As I found, the truth is indeed stranger than one can imagine. By July 22, 2004, I was about 6 months into my current state of unemployment. We had moved 3 times since leaving New York in 2003, even being without a place to call home for a while. I had been forced to sell my car and most of my possessions. My Range Rover was repossessed, and I no longer had health insurance, an address, telephone, credit card, cell phone, bank account, etc. And by this time, my fiancée was solely supporting us on her tips as a waitress. And mind you, just the year before, we were both making several $100,000s a year. It's obscene that a corporation can retaliate and take away your rights, your income, your career, and your credit rating for blowing the whistle on events such as those that I witnessed. And to know now that it takes years to seek resolution for said retaliatory actions, which were approved and carried out only by means of a wink or a nod, gives me little faith in returning to my old career anytime soon. Not to mention the fact that there is absolutely no accountability in many senses means that there is no longer any objectivity in the authoritative agencies who are tasked to protect the rights of employees and investors, and no willing authority to promptly and legitimately investigate, possibly as a result of the cross-pollination of corporate cash interests which plagues our economy today. But I'm deviating from the point. By the summer of 2004, we were living out of boxes and sleeping on a mattress on someone else's living room floor. On the morning of July 22nd, I was awaiting the uploading of what would become known as the 9/11 Omission Report, which I immediately downloaded as soon as it was made available to the public. I then sat and read the so-called report and the alleged conclusions of the commission in its entirety. And any denial I had left in my mind was obliterated as to what was actually being carried out, as it was in reading the 9/11 Omission Report wherein I realized just how deep the deceit of September 11th ran. It was a mirror image of the Warren Report, but much more blatantly misleading and comprehensively more treasonous. My cognitive dissonance regarding 9/11 dissolved, and along with it, all hope of justice ever being served by the so-called commission. And in hindsight, I had my suspicions of the commission even before they published their so-called recommendations. From the commission's origin, 444 days after 9/11, when Heinz Kissinger was nominated to lead it, and then he was replaced by Tom Kane, who was equally biased. And from there, the cast of characters resembled a police lineup of infamously associated and similarly compromised misleaders, all of whom seemed to have a conflict of interest with the truth, and sought at all times to conceal rather than reveal the truth in its proceedings. For instance, Janie Gorelick is on the board of United Technologies Corporation, which is owned by Carlyle Group. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Bob Kerry's involvement in the BCCI laundering cover-up and the rest of the mercenary congressional representatives owned by the security industrial complex needs to be recognized and realized by creating an informed public. With this perspective in mind, it's easy to understand why the Commission so readily accepted the testimony of the President and Vice President without even so much as swearing them to oath. Because you see, they weren't interrogating them, they were conducting an internal meeting, one which neither you nor I was privy to attend. I was disappointed in myself for allowing my instincts to take a back seat to social acceptance, and for not reading the writing on the wall earlier and raising my voice louder, as I should have. In response, on that same day, I started creating public awareness montages of independent media, bringing together the best of what I could find to clearly relate what really happened, in an initial effort to create some sort of media whereby one could communicate the information necessary to awaken the public mind. I then started to circulate samples of this information on computer disks, DVDs, and CDs to people with a voice in these affairs, along with information such as I've contained herein. On September 11th, 2004, we took our first steps toward bridging this informational gap, after we had corresponded with Kristen Breitweiser, But after sending samples of this information, we no longer received any response, and while she was obviously well informed enough to understand, she may not have had the freedom to take action. So then I looked at the 9/11 issue and said, if we have this information, by what other means can we get it out to the people? After a long search for a place to live, which was exacerbated by my financially being blackballed and disavowed, we found a landlord who was willing to take a chance on us and rent us a small apartment after being turned down several times for my recently downgraded credit rating. Having our own space again helped me to formulate new avenues of exploration in an attempt to get anyone with a free voice to look at the facts of 9/11. A comprehensive effort had to be coordinated to provide the necessary baseline understanding to the people so that meaningful actions can be undertaken to resolve the issues set forth in the post-9/11 world. And considering that I was unemployed, and still am, I certainly had the time to embark on such a journey. On October 24th, 2004, I launched a campaign I call Project Constellation. It's a networking effort designed to deliver meaningful information to outspoken voices in our society for their consumption, research, and eventual dissemination, for the purpose of directing the course of those who look to them for guidance. In short, I was attempting to introduce the information that I have offered in part thus far in a manner which would enlist people of like mind to come together over common causes for the purpose of giving a multifaceted truth, a multidimensional form through which it can be comprehensively communicated to the public mind by producing a note which, when studied, produces a chord. All puns intended. And again, I may have been more than a bit naive in thinking that I could do this all without outside help. And at the time, I had no idea how tough it was going to be to get the attention of someone who could agree to the idea of 9/11 being something other than what the media had labeled it, and that same person simultaneously having the freedom, liberty, and ambition to present these very divisive ideas in the public arena. In a desperate attempt to open such a line of communication with someone I hoped still had a free voice and a conscience, on December 17th, 21st, and 27th of 2004 and January 12th of 2005, I sent a variety of faxes, letters, and parcels to the attention of Harrison Ford, care of his publicist, Patricia McQueenie. Specifically in the second package, which weighed 31 pounds and arrived in a stainless steel briefcase, there was information pertaining to a man-made disaster being created, what was to be the tsunamis that hit Indonesia. And the contents also referred to the hundreds of thousands who would be killed, arriving just days before the disaster. My hope was to put the information into the hands of someone with a voice, and in my mind, Harrison's pretty well known. He's been the President, Jack Ryan, Han Solo, and Indiana Jones. In other words, people might listen to what he has to say, and considering that we were living in what seemed to be a leaderless society, I decided to take the chance that he would listen. To offer some insight into what I can't share right now regarding man-made disasters, Tesla-based weapons like HAARP, H-A-A-R-P, leave a unique signature which differentiates their manifestations from those which occur in nature. And if you know what to look for, you can identify man-made earthquakes such as the Iranian quake, which occurred 1 year to the day before the Indonesian tsunamis. Electromagnetic weaponry can be used to create environments where soft invasions take place, as a non-confrontational way to invade hostile but poor areas like Iran, Pakistan, and Indonesia. I would recommend a documentary called Holes in Heaven, wherein the scientists and patent holders for the HAARP project are interviewed. Moving on, about this same time, I saw a film called Born Rich by HBO documentary filmmaker and Johnson & Johnson heir, Jamie Johnson. It was about rich kids who had no idea how their families had acquired and maintained so much wealth and power, and since I had some ideas on the subject, my fiancé and I met with Jamie in New York on January 23rd, 2005, and we told him all about 9/11. We initially thought this would be an interesting meeting of the minds, considering that Jamie was just out of college and seemed to be searching for an outlet for his attention and resources, though admittedly now we had no idea then how large the disconnect would be. Mainly he was in disbelief, and in the face of evidence which related that Bush indeed knew and was an active participant in the cover-up and the pre-war contracts and planning, he denied that the president would ever be associated with terrorists. He questioned, for instance, the viability of using radio frequency identifiers, better known as RFIDs, to track humans, until I explained to him the history behind Herman Hollerith's IBM tracking system that led to the Jews being tattooed with Hollerith numbers in the concentration camps, and that the technology later evolved into the barcode and is now the Verichip implantable tracking device, which is funded, in no small part, by IBM. Though I did not mention to him how dependent RFIDs are on database and storage assets. After hearing us out and having heard us relate how complicit the media was in all of this, he suggested that although he was not someone who could help, that we should, quote, go to the press. The irony just froze us, but his denial was protected by a fortune of money that he hadn't earned, and a life yet to be explored, and he wanted it to stay that way, so he removed this information, and us, from his perception. In a similar effort, I talked my way past security and left correspondence in the green room when Jon Stewart was performing here in Hartford. Then in February of 2005, I wrote to Larry and Jimmy Flint on the anniversary of Larry's lawsuit against Donald Rumsfeld. In this case, the brothers Flint replied with a cease and desist order from their attorneys in response to my recommendation that Hustler cover the 9/11 phenomenon. As I naively envisioned Hustler as being a viable communication mechanism possibly still outside of the controlled mass media, and Flint as a self-espoused First Amendment advocate through which this information could plausibly be disseminated specifically to our troops. As irony would again have it, in June of 2005, Flint printed the August 2005 issue of Hustler, which contained an article wherein the precise topic we had suggested was discussed, stopping short of communicating the details which revealed the big picture to the reader, of course. We also met with 9/11 Truth Community investigative journalists, and I use that term very loosely here. I'm not going to use this precious time to engage in trash talking, but I will offer that there's a very logical reason why the 9/11 Truth movement has been in constant turmoil since its inception. It's infested with COINTELPRO and agents provocateur. So at this point, I again changed up our tactics, and we started engaging with groups that were allegedly representing the 9/11 victims' families, as well as other families of the victims of the War on Terror, which of course includes soldiers' families. One firm worthy of mention is Motley Rice. Ron Motley is a billionaire attorney infamous for making his money in the big tobacco settlements, and is known for his patriotism because his firm represents over 6,000 families associated with the War on Terror. And he has used over $12 million of his own money to allegedly investigate the terrorist funding that led to 9/11, seeking to prosecute the real terrorists, or so at least he claims. My fiancé and I met with Motley Rice on 2 occasions for several hours and provided evidence pertaining to their alleged quest for the truth. After we led them through the flow of currency in the network of perpetrators and profiteers, they agreed and admitted that we had indeed offered evidence which identified some of the very same defendants named in their court documents. However, when we demonstrated that the alleged money was not flowing from Islamic charities, but rather, for example, instances wherein the money was flowing through patsy organizations back to corporate entities, for instance, based out of New York, and that these same entities were comprised of, for instance, the counterterrorism experts and the insurance companies, at which time we were ushered out and our evidence was mailed back to us. That evidence is still sealed in the Motley Rice envelope that it was sent back in a secure location along with the MP3 tracks of those meetings, wherein it is admittedly evident that Motley Rice is not seeking to find the roots of the murders of 9/11 victims or to seek answers for the families which they claim to represent. Rather, their actions indicate that they are acting to contain these people and to further victimize them by preventing them from finding any real answers or attaining any true state of closure. Motley Rice is unabashedly lacking any genuine interest in relevant information pertaining to the true funding of the 9/11 events, and the families who Motley Rice claims to represent deserve to know the truth as much as anyone else who lost loved ones, friends, or co-workers on September 11th. After having spent every day of the last several years assessing the 9/11 terrain, I engaged a few select independent investigative journalists outside of the so-called 9/11 Truth Community, and I shared with them different pieces of what I know, based on confidentiality. I allowed their work to reflect this information to a degree, but not to the point where it would risk their lives by allowing them to print it without certain support structures in place. Occasionally, I did this under the pseudonym of Eric Andrew Blair. I also continue to engage independent filmmakers as I felt that much of the 9/11 documentary landscape was barren of certain critical and unique facts. I found a few films worth mentioning in the context of this conversation because they were produced by talents who have been carrying more than their fair share of weight over the past several years. While many interested in 9/11 have already become well acquainted with the second edition of a film called Loose Change, I specifically wanted to reference the work of Louder Than Words production, Dylan, Corey, and Jason, because they're an excellent example of the power of a few young minds, and while they seem to be well informed, they're also very wise for their age. They're trailblazers and have produced what I consider to be the most palatable and widely consumable documentary of the 9/11 genre, because it presents the facts without fanfare, and it addresses sensitive topics with grace and professionalism. It's also worth mentioning that in light of the $9 million odd in the American Airlines and United Airlines put options fraud that went unclaimed, and the dump truck full of gold bricks found abandoned underneath the World Trade Center, that it's only through the loose change that we're all able to study the evidence left behind by the criminals. It's the best we have left to examine since Giuliani sold the rest to China. Continuing down that line of thought, one critical piece of media which has most likely until now evaded your radar is a film called Who Killed John O'Neill? The filmmaker and actor became friends of ours as the film projects major parallels to the personal and professional experiences that I've described in part herein. It also offers information that is found in no other 9/11 film, thereby offering some serious food for thought, especially in light of what I'm sharing with you now and offering to share in the future. Who Killed John O'Neill is less about what happened on 9/11 and more about the ultimate purposes of the events, how they were orchestrated and achieved, and what people can do about it. So if you're pressed for time, I'd suggest forwarding directly to Chapter 7 on Kroll Associates, as I think that you'll see that many of the most interesting and relevant correlations in tune with the information herein are found between there and the end of the film. I've constructed this message as a bridge between the two aforementioned films, and crossing this bridge is essential if you really want to understand the foundations of 9/11, as it presents a context through which you can see the real problems, and only then can you ascertain even part of the overall solutions that must be implemented if we are to come together as a nation of concerned citizens and revitalize our constitutional republic. What I've included herein is a high-level overview of some of my experiences in relation to 9/11, while simultaneously providing novel information which has yet to be openly circulated in the public mind, in a genuine attempt to distill the value of this information, evidence, and experiences that our documentation represents to those seeking answers. As you can readily hear, I'm willing and able to do whatever it takes to make a meaningful, benevolent, and constructive progress toward dissemination and discussion of these events in a public forum, as a measure to ensure that the public mind receives the antidote to the poison poured in our ears in the years before and since September 11th. We, the people, have been denied our right to make informed choices and decisions in our lives due to illicit actions shrouded in secrecy, and we're all being lied to. Therefore, no one in our society without the truth is genuinely acting on his or her own behalf, but rather is always making decisions which benefit those who control our information. This is accomplished by total corporate control over our media, where the decision makers work in the interests of the advertisers and the lobbyists rather than their ultimate customers, the public. But we can change all of that with a single idea. The control wielded over the public mind by a perjurious administration and a propagandized media network is veiled by anonymity, shielded by patriotic notions of our post-9/11 actions, and defended by the denial of our own responsibility in these matters. And what it amounts to is nothing less than capitalism run amok. However, it only takes a small crack in that control system to yield the dissolution of the foundations of that anonymity. And like cockroaches in the light of truth, those who are responsible are much more likely to run for cover rather than to face an informed public which has now learned that it has been and is still being denied their right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that unavoidable anger within the American people doesn't even compare to the ire we've earned from the rest of the world, who has watched in horror from outside while we all sat around here wondering if indeed such a conspiracy could exist. To that I say people should check out Carol Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, which until recently was suppressed and out of print, or James H. Billington's book, Fire in the Minds of Men, two examples which could readily expand one's comprehension of these topics to the necessary perspective, where one realizes that the conspiracy is not an unknown variable, but rather a given constant, which is critical and balanced in the equation of 9/11. Or you can simply go online and read the 15-page Operation Northwoods document from 1962. Either way, reading a few pages of the right document can change a lot about how you see the world. You see, our enemy knows that we don't do our homework, and that is, in fact, the current Achilles heel of America. To quote the author Mark Lane's book, Plausible Denial, Perhaps this is what Dulles was thinking when he told the Warren Commission on July 9, 1964. But nobody reads. Don't believe people read in this country. There will be very few professors who read the record, and the public will read very little. If you fail to see the irony of the Dulles observation, you're missing the boat. It's no different than the symbolism of Bush sitting and reading the pet goat for 7 minutes instead of taking action. He knew he was in no danger. The Secret Service knew he was in no danger. It's the use of knowledge as power over a panicking people, and right behind his head was a sign that read, "Reading makes a country great." I would also notice the photo op that same morning where the president is pictured with Lynn Cheney's book, America, wherein he is holding it upside down so that the United States flag is represented as a distress signal. These are all twisted symbols of power being flaunted right before our eyes like a masterfully choreographed play wherein real people die and suffer for the entertainment of others who think that all people are born equal, but some people are born more equal than others, to amend the work of another great author. You know, maybe Dulles was right. Maybe you wouldn't have read the 33 pages of transcription notes that amount to this message. But I'm betting that doesn't matter now, does it? And to drive this home, I offer the following historical time series analysis of the symbolism of the date chosen for the attacks. And you tell me if being familiar with our own history is necessary to identifying the root cause of critical events which shape all of our lives. September 11th, 1922. The League of Nations signed a post-Balfour Declaration regarding the future creation of a Zionist state, what was to become Israel, noting that Zionism is a political movement derived out of the infamous Dreyfus Affair in France in the late 1800s. The same group responsible for this declaration eventually created what's called the Council on Foreign Relations, and thus one of the many connections to Dulles in relation to 9/11. To this day, the Council on Foreign Relations has influence over all of our political, media, and economic variables. September 11th, 1941. Ground was broken on the Pentagon, noting that it was destroyed exactly 60 years to the day later. September 11th, 1971. Construction began on both the North and South Tower. That same day, Nikita Khrushchev died, and there was also the famous riot at Attica Prison in New York, noting, of course, that the Twin Towers were destroyed 30 years to the day after their birth. September 11th, 1973. After Kissinger's Operation Condor set the scene, the CIA sponsored one of many coups, specifically where Augusto Pinochet used planes and missiles to overthrow democratically elected Salvador Allende in Chile. September 11th, 1991. The infamous George H.W. Bush New World Order speech, 11 years to the day before 9/11. September 11th, 1995. Reports surfaced that a remote-controlled plane was crashed into the White House. September 11th, 1998. Kenneth Starr, nephew of AIG founder C.V. Starr, sends his infamous report on Bill Clinton to Congress. And I would note here that both Hillary and Bill Clinton were involved in the Mena, Arkansas drug smuggling operation for over a decade before their presidency. But Starr didn't report on that, did he? September 11th, 2005. The State of Israel declares an end to their occupation of the Gaza Strip, also relating back to the September 11th, 1922 root cause event of that conflict. All of these events are Council on Foreign Relations related activities. So who runs the CFR? Well, that's an interesting question. And the answers are not best explained in this form, but regardless, they're not necessary for one to start taking meaningful action. You see, by simply replacing the information which has been omitted from our historical reference of real-time events, in other words, with a little study and a lot of attention to one's surroundings, it's all as plain as the white arrow inside of the FedEx logo. And we, the people, can no longer afford to be ignorant, especially about our own history or our place in it, because soon, without synchronized change in response to oncoming dangers, we will be on the losing end of that battle. Our country has been under attack now for almost 5 years, and not one of the legitimate terrorists has been named in the media, let alone brought to justice for their part in these events. In fact, most of them didn't even lose their jobs, and in many cases, if not all, they received funding increases that they requested to monitor their enemy, and ironically, it is the alleged enemy who funds the surveillance. We as individuals must assume the responsibility that we all share for allowing this situation to go on this long unchecked. And we as a country must take action, identify common ground, and then take all measures necessary to defend what we love and to stand as one against the real terrorists and our true enemy, corporate fundamentalism and greed. And if we fail to find our unified voice, which demands that those responsible for planning, perpetrating, and profiting from the events of 9/11 be brought to justice, then our country will continue to lose friends and make enemies. And make no mistake, behind all the smoke and mirrors of 9/11, there are people responsible who are more likely to be wearing a three-piece suit and walking down Wall Street than hiding with a fellow Shema-shrouded Taliban cave dweller outside of Kandahar. Unless you can explain to me how the Taliban infiltrated the secure vaults under the World Trade Center and stole hundreds of billions in bullion, and why the owners of that bullion are keeping quiet, or how they got NORAD to conveniently schedule 6 simultaneous drills the same morning that they were planning to pay homage to the birthdays of their target buildings. In fact, those truly responsible are associated with commercial companies and government and private intelligence entities which, in many cases, are openly traded on the stock market and deeply associated with the rogue administration which seized power of our country in the 2000 election. And sadly, we're more likely to see Barry Bonds on trial for perjury before those responsible for deceiving the American people during one of the most critical times in our short history. In order to regain control of our country, it's going to take people who understand what this information means to the future of America. People who are not afraid to broach complex and sometimes controversial but factual aspects of our own recent history. Though the truth may sometimes be unpopular, it is the truth nonetheless. And everyone deserves the right to have the truth made available. Whether or not they decide to take their medicine should be up to them. To that end, a public media intervention needs to be created to represent the truth in all of its forms, and in its absence, revive and restore it to the people. The true mettle of a constitutional republic is not tested by its struggle to be born, but rather by gracefully surviving the transition into maturity with its constitutions intact. And to that end, we're brought to the inevitable question: so where do we go from here? Well, if any of what I've said resonates with you, we can do one of two things based upon your level of interest. Feel free to let it marinate for a while and perhaps listen again and do some research on your own, and then email me with any questions or comments you may have. Or simply pick up the phone and give me a call, and let's set up a more expedient yet secure way to exchange information. You can reach me telephonically or by leaving a voicemail at 917-779-9215. Or you can send me an email at the following address: richard@renaissance-interventures.com. In closing, I've been working to crack the code which catalyzes the public mind, and the only component I'm lacking is the vehicle through which I can introduce this information. So I thought that if you and I just sat down in the same room, we might be able to recognize readily available resources through which we can comprehensively inform the public with respect to the topics contained herein. So what I'm hoping you've realized, if you hadn't already, is that the game has been changed and the tables turned against us. So it's only through this sort of creative communication and constructive collaboration we'll find the spark necessary to catalyze the people into action. Otherwise, it would have happened already, and we wouldn't be sitting here right now. Someone needs to do something to bring an end to the hypocrisy surrounding 9/11 and the corrosive foreign policies propagated in its wake. And I say that it's time for us to change the game in our favor. Canceling out these destructive waves is as straightforward as introducing a simple wave interference pattern. And it's my contention that communication is exactly the type of interference necessary. And while I'm personally still searching for the right frequency which brings it all into harmony, it's only a matter of trial and error. And any day now, we could get lucky and strike a chord. To quote my favorite mid-1st century AD philosopher, Seneca, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And with that, I'll bring this initial message to a close and say that I'm looking forward to your thoughts and questions, and I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. And of course, don't forget to thank yourself for taking this opportunity to tune in and not drop out.
Well, Richard found his vehicle. He found the right frequency. He found the Maria Heller Show, where I'm always open to listening to inside scoops, and you heard it first here.